The subway station was old. Not just old in the way that things grow old, but ancient in the way places left behind by time become when no one cares for them anymore. Most people didn't even know it existed, and those who did had long forgotten it. It wasn't on any modern maps, and the city planners had no records of it. It was as if the station had simply ceased to exist in the consciousness of the city. But it was still there, hidden beneath the layers of progress and indifference. In the late 1980s, it had been closed down due to renovations. It was supposed to reopen a year later, but the project ran out of funds, and the city moved on without it. Since then, the old station had been left to decay, its entrance barred with rusted metal gates and faded, closed for construction signs. Most people hurried past it without a second glance. But for a few, the ones who had nowhere else to go, it was home. One such man was Howard. He had been living on the streets for years, pushed out of society by bad luck, poor choices, and a string of tragedies. Howard wasn't his real name, but it's what he called himself now. He'd left his old name behind with his old life, and with each passing year, it became harder to remember the man he had once been. Howard had discovered the abandoned station purely by accident. One winter night, seeking shelter from the biting wind, he had stumbled across the entrance. The gates were locked, but a section of the fence had been cut away, leaving just enough room for a person to squeeze through. Desperation and cold had driven him inside. The station was a relic of a bygone era. The walls were lined with cracked ceramic tiles, once white but now stained with the grime of decades. Old advertisements, their colors faded and peeling, clung to the walls, showing scenes from a time long past. The air was thick with dust, and the only sounds were the occasional drip of water from the ceiling and the scurrying of rats in the dark corners. Howard set up his makeshift camp in one of the old ticket booths. It wasn't much, just a few blankets, a small pile of scavenged food, and a cardboard box for a bed. But it was more than he'd had in a long time, and most importantly, it was safe, or so he thought. The first few nights passed uneventfully. Howard slept deeply, lulled by the silence and the sense of isolation. It was a different kind of silence than what he was used to on the streets. Out there, even in the dead of night, there were always sounds. The distant hum of traffic, the occasional shout or siren. But down here, the silence was thick, almost oppressive, as if the station itself was holding its breath. But then, on the third night, something changed. Howard woke up with a start. He wasn't sure what had roused him, but as he lay there in the dark, he realized the silence was no longer comforting. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. He strained his ears, trying to catch any sound, any hint of what might have woken him. But there was nothing, just the sound of his own breathing. He told himself it was nothing, just his imagination playing tricks on him. But even as he tried to convince himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He felt a cold chill run down his spine, and his heart began to race. For the first time since he'd found the station, he felt genuinely afraid. Suddenly, there was a noise, a soft, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It was faint, But in the stillness of the station, it was unmistakable. Howard froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound grew louder, closer. It was coming from the tunnel, the one that led deeper into the station, to where the old tracks still lay in the dark. Howard's instincts screamed at him to run, to get out of there as fast as he could. But his body wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed with fear, his mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there, in the dark. The sound continued, drawing nearer, until it was just outside the ticket booth. And then it stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Howard didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. He squeezed his eyes shut, hoping, praying that whatever it was would go away. But then he heard it. A voice, low and rasping, barely more than a whisper. "Can I eat you?" The words sent a jolt of terror through Howard's body. His eyes flew open, and he stared into the darkness, trying to see where the voice had come from. But there was nothing, just the blackness of the tunnel and the cold, empty station. "Can I eat you?" The voice came again, closer this time. Howard scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get out of there. He grabbed his things, stuffing them into a bag with shaking hands. The voice repeated its question, each time growing more insistent, more eager. "Can I eat you? Can I eat you? Can I eat you?" Howard ran. He didn't look back, didn't stop until he was outside the station, gasping for breath in the cold night air. His heart was still racing, and he could feel the sweat pouring down his face. But he didn't stop. He kept running, as far away from the station as he could, until his legs gave out and he collapsed in an alleyway. He never went back to the station, but the voice haunted him. It followed him in his dreams, whispering its terrible question over and over again. No matter where he went, he could never escape it. And as the years passed, the fear that had gripped him that night began to fade, replaced by a deep, gnawing dread. Because deep down, Howard knew that the voice wasn't just asking for permission. It was making a promise. The origins of the station. In the days following his encounter at the old subway station, Howard found himself consumed by an uncontrollable curiosity about the place he had fled from. The terror of that night had imprinted itself deeply in his mind, but it was the mystery that drove him back into the labyrinthine underbelly of the city, not to the station itself, but to the libraries and archives that might hold the secrets of its history. Howard learned that the station had been built in the early 1920s as part of an expansion project for the city's rapidly growing subway system. The project had been ambitious, involving the construction of several new lines and stations. But as with many ambitious projects, it was plagued by problems. There were delays, accidents, and rumors of corruption. And then, halfway through construction, the project was abruptly canceled. Officially, it was due to budget cuts and the onset of the Great Depression. But Howard began to suspect there was more to the story. The more he dug, the more unsettling the history of the station became. There were whispers of unexplained deaths during the construction, workers who had disappeared, only to be found days later, their bodies mangled and disfigured in ways that couldn't be easily explained. There were also stories of strange occurrences in the area around the station. People who lived nearby reported hearing strange noises in the night, scratching, whispering, and the occasional distant scream. Animals would go missing, and plants near the entrance would wither and die for no apparent reason. Howard found a particularly disturbing account in an old, yellowed newspaper article from the 1930s. It told the story of a homeless man, much like himself, who had been found dead near the station entrance. The man's body had been horribly mutilated, and his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The police had dismissed it as a tragic accident, but the article hinted at something more sinister, something that the authorities were unwilling or unable to explain. As he continued his research, Howard began to notice a pattern. Every few decades, there were reports of strange happenings around the old station. Disappearances, mysterious deaths, and always the whispering voice asking its terrible question. The incidents seemed to follow a cycle, as if the station itself was waking up, hungry, and reaching out for new victims. But what haunted Howard the most was the realization that he wasn't the first to have heard the voice. He found references to it in several old diaries and letters, each describing the same eerie question, "Can I eat you?" The accounts varied in detail, but they all shared the same bone-chilling sense of dread. The people who heard the voice were never the same afterward. Some went mad, others disappeared, and those who survived were plagued by nightmares and an unshakable feeling of being watched. The deeper Howard dug, the more he became convinced that the station was not just a place. It was something more, something ancient and malevolent that had been hiding beneath the city for decades, maybe even centuries. And whatever it was hungry, the descent into madness. Despite the fear that gnawed at him, Howard couldn't resist the pull of the station. He had to know the truth, even if it meant facing the horror he had fled from. And so, against his better judgment, he made his way back to the old subway station. It was a cold, foggy evening when Howard returned. The city was quiet, the streets deserted. He felt a mixture of dread and determination as he approached the entrance, the rusty gates and the faded signs now seeming more ominous than ever. The hole in the fence was still there, and he squeezed through it with a familiar sense of trepidation. The station was as he remembered, dark, dusty, and silent. But now, with his newfound knowledge, it felt different. The silence seemed to press in on him, suffocating and expectant. Howard made his way to the ticket booth, the same place where he had spent those nights. He sat there, trying to gather his courage, and began to explore the station more thoroughly than he had before. He ventured into the dark tunnels, using a flashlight to pierce through the blackness. He followed the old tracks, hoping to find something that would explain the station's sinister reputation. As he moved deeper into the station, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The air was thick and stagnant, and the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, as if they had a life of their own. The scratching noises that he had heard before began again, echoing through the tunnels. Howard's heart raced, and he felt the cold breath of fear on the back of his neck. Then he saw it. At the end of one of the tunnels, there was a large, rusted door partially open. Howard approached it with trepidation, his flashlight revealing a room beyond. Inside, the walls were covered in old, peeling paint, and the floor was littered with debris. But what caught his eye was a series of strange markings on the walls, symbols and patterns that he didn't recognize, but that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Howard's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The symbols were unlike anything he had ever encountered. They seemed to shift and change as he looked at them, as if they were alive. And as he studied them, he felt a creeping sense of dread, as if the symbols were somehow connected to the voice he had heard. Suddenly, the room was filled with a low, guttural sound. A growl or a moan. He couldn't be sure. The air grew colder, and Howard's flashlight flickered and died. He was plunged into darkness, and the scratching noises grew louder, more frantic. Felt as if something was moving around him, closing in. Howard's breath came in ragged gasps as he fumbled to relight his flashlight. He managed to get it working again, and the beam cut through the darkness. But what he saw made his blood run cold. There, in the shadows, was a figure. A ghostly, gaunt shape with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. It was reaching out toward him, its bony fingers extended in a grotesque imitation of a welcoming gesture. The voice came again, this time louder and more insistent. "Can I eat you? Can I eat you?" Howard stumbled backward, his mind reeling. He turned and fled, running blindly through the tunnels. The scratching sound followed him, growing closer with each step. His heart pounded in his chest, and his legs felt like lead. He had to get out. He had to escape. As he reached the entrance of the station, he heard the voice one last time, faint but unmistakable. "Can I eat you?" Howard didn't stop running until he was back on the streets, gasping for air. He looked over his shoulder, but the station was gone, hidden in the dark depths of the city. He never spoke of what he had seen, but the fear stayed with him. It was a fear that gnawed at him, an unshakable terror that he couldn't escape. The old subway station remained a hidden relic of the city's past, and its dark history continued to haunt those who knew of it. Howard's encounter was just one in a long line of disturbing stories connected to the place. The voice, with its insatiable hunger, continued to whisper in the darkness, waiting for the next person to stumble into its lair. And somewhere, deep beneath the city, the station waited, its ancient hunger never truly sated. This story is a work of fiction, combining elements of urban legend with psychological horror. It captures the eerie atmosphere of an abandoned place and the chilling idea of an insatiable, malevolent presence.